Hey, here I am underneath my wild and unruly apple tree. I really like it. Look how pretty the blossoms are, and I like the branches, and I like how strong the trunk is. It's good, good fruit comes out of it. The problem is I haven't done my job very well in the last few years, and I haven't cut it back as much as I should have. And if I had, I think the fruit would be more productive and be healthier. And that reminds me of a guy we're going to be talking about today. Now, we've talked about people in the Old Testament and how God has used them, but we're going to be talking today about somebody who is in the New Testament, somebody who actually knew Jesus really well and yet still had some growth to take place in his life, and that's Peter. When you think of Peter, you might think of the story of him cutting off the servant's ear. You might think about him walking on water. Maybe you think about him saying he didn't know Jesus 3 times. We read about him in the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels, also the book of Acts, especially chapters 1 through 12. Maybe you've read 1st and 2nd Peter. If you haven't read any of those things, I encourage you to do that. They're really helpful. But the first place where we meet Peter was him out on the Sea of Galilee, and he's a fisherman, and he's been fishing for all night and hasn't caught anything, and Jesus tells him to do, which seems insane to him, do the exact same thing and hope that something different happens. But Peter says, okay, well, Jesus, because you said to do it, even though it doesn't make sense, I'm going to do it. And he does, and he has this miraculous catch of fish. But his response is, Jesus, get away from me, I'm a sinful man. Peter needs to grow, and he needs to realize, and one day he will realize, that sin in his life doesn't mean that he needs to stay away from Jesus. In fact, it's the opposite, that when we have sin in our life, that means that we need Jesus even more, and we need to grow closer to him. Later on, we see him out on the Sea of Galilee again, and there's the middle of a storm, and Jesus comes walking up to them, walking on water, and Peter says, Jesus, if that's you, call me out onto the water. And he does, and as he walks out onto the water, he looks around and he sees the waves and the storm, and he's discouraged, and he concentrates on those things, and he takes his eyes off Jesus, and because of that, he starts to sink, and Jesus has to pull him up out. And we're going to see that Peter later on is going to grow into somebody who has a greater faith in Jesus, and he's able to do some amazing things because of that faith in Jesus. At one point, Peter does something amazing. Jesus asks his disciples, well, who do the people say who I am? And they have some different ideas, and he says, well, who do you say that I am? It's a really important question. And Peter answers, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, you're right. And you know what? You know this because God has told you this. But Peter follows up this highlight part of his life with him telling Jesus, you know what, Jesus, I know you're saying you're supposed to die, but no, that's not the right way. Peter needs to learn, and he will learn, that what we think is the best is not always the best, and that God has a better way. At some point again, towards the end of Jesus' life on earth, he tells his disciples what's going to happen, and Jesus is told by Peter, you know what, I'll die with you. And Jesus says, you know what, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny you know me 3 times. And that boldness that Peter seems to have on his own is not strong enough. And that strength on our own is not enough. However, there are a couple events that happen in Peter's life, and we realize that he's changed. And the first one is that Peter personally experiences Jesus' death and resurrection. He sees it. He sees Jesus again, and he sees him as a risen Lord. And because of that, and what happens 50 days after that, is the Pentecost. And at Pentecost, the Holy Spirit comes. And because of Peter's interaction with Jesus after he's risen from the dead, and because the Holy Spirit has come into his life, just like the Holy Spirit comes into our life when we become Christians, he's changed. Now, Peter's still that same bold, strong personality. He's still influential. But those things are used by God in a new way. Peter allows himself to be used. Spiritual growth doesn't mean we become different people. Peter has the same personality, but those things which were liabilities when he tried to do it in his own power became tools, and God uses those things to make Peter the kind of man who ends up being a leader in the church, who does these amazing miracles through God's power, who is an example to us. So you might look in your own life and you might think, what are some things that are significant to me? What are some things that are descriptive of me? are those things that God needs to harness and needs to make into something that He can use for His kingdom. And I look forward to seeing how God uses those things in your life.